Well, good day to everybody. Welcome to Faith Seeking Understanding and to another episode of one of our programs here, the Wesleyan Way, where we talk about all things Methodist. I am Alan Bevere, your host, and I am a pastor, retired. I am a professor, a Bible moth, a theologian in exile, and a peddler of hope. And I am also the self-appointed Anselm of Canterbury Chair of Podcast Theology and Culture here at Faith Seeking Understanding University, a completely made-up university, but where all seekers are welcome to ponder profound things free of charge. And I am very happy to have as my guest today, Donna Fowler-Marchant. Did I pronounce that correctly?
Close enough.
Okay.
It's Fowler-Marchant.
Fowler-Marchant,
yeah.
Marchant, okay. Donna Fowler-Marchant, Reverend Doctor. She is a United Methodist pastor, member of the North Carolina Conference, currently serving 4 churches in the UK. Where are you in the UK?
I am about 20 minutes by train from central London.
Okay.
So I'm just north of London.
Very good. Okay. Well, thank you so much for taking time to be here today. And we're talking today about your book. Here it is, folks, Mothers in Israel. And I love that name, by the way. And I'm going to ask you to explain that in a minute. Mothers in Israel, Methodist Beginnings Through the Eyes of Women. This is a really good book. And, you know, I thought it was rather knowledgeable about women in the Methodist movement, but boy, not really. I learned a lot, and I appreciate this book. What gave rise to you writing this book?
There's a long way back you could go to trace it, I suppose. I went undergraduate to Meredith College in Raleigh, North Carolina, which is a women's college. And during my time there, I became very interested in women's voices and women's history and the things that you often didn't hear about. And then when I was at Duke, I did my MDiv and my THM at Duke. I was interested, at that time I was actually Baptist. I wasn't Methodist. And so I was interested in kind of researching early Baptist women and what they had contributed to that particular movement. But then eventually I did become United Methodist, and I did a D-Min through Wesley Seminary on spirituality and story. And the thing that I did my big project on for my D-Min had to do with clergy women and unique challenges that face them and some possible ways that could be lessened, if you will. And it was called Fire in Our Bones, United Methodist Clergy Women Faithful to the Divine Call. So it was rooted in the whole idea of being created in God's image, being called by Christ, and being gifted by the Spirit for ministry. And so naturally, there was also a historical component to it. And so I told just a little bit about early Methodism and the role that women played in that, and the ways that John Wesley was very instrumental in encouraging that and really helping these women's voices to be heard. So the seeds have been sown along and along, I would say. Then in 2017, I came over here to the UK for a sabbatical. And I spent the first probably 5 or 6 weeks traveling around England. I was going to lots of the Wesley places. I went to the New Room in Bristol. I went to Wesley's Chapel, London. I spent 2 weeks in Epworth, which they burst out laughing. They said, nobody spends 2 weeks in Epworth. And I said, well, I am. And I spent a little over a week in Manchester at the John Rylands Library, which is where the largest group of Methodist archives in the world are located. And in order to be able to access those archives and those amazing artifacts, I had to be established as a researcher. So I contacted a bunch of different people to get them to vouch for me that I wasn't some random person, wanting to go in there and wreak havoc. So I got approved as a genuine researcher at this amazing place, and wound up having the opportunity to examine letters from John Wesley to family members, to ministers, to some of these women, letters back to him and to Charles. Charles's manuscripts of some of his hymns. I mean, just an amazing wealth of stuff there. I mean, you couldn't live long enough to go through it all. It's amazing. And so I had the idea that I wanted to do something about Wesley and women and how that played out in early Methodism, but I didn't really have a strong focus for it at that point. So after my sabbatical was over and I was trying to sort of process everything that had gone on, I talked to various people and they said, oh, well, I think you've got a book in that. You need to kind of see if you can narrow it down, blah, blah, blah. And like a lot of people, unless I have a deadline in front of me or somebody pushing me from behind, I don't necessarily, jump right on something. So it just sort of simmered for a while. And then Kathy Armistead, who was at GBHEM in the department that dealt with the two imprints they have, the Foundry Press and what is the other one? Anyway, there's two that they've got through GBHEM. She and I had become friends on Facebook and had chatted about various things having to do with this. And she said, I think you've got the germ of a book there, get back with me. And I just kind of hadn't. And then she contacted me again and she said, let's get serious about this. And I went, oh, sign from God. Okay. So I really jumped back into it at that point. And I'd been researching it on and off. I mean, I can't tell you how many books I bought, how many articles online I printed out. I mean, I probably killed, a million trees with all these things I printed out. And it sort of solidified into trying to look at these women, not simply as in relation to Wesley, but in relationship to each other, because that was a really important component of who they were and of their ministry. So that's kind of where all that went. And when I got the instructions basically for how to structure the thing and get it outlined and send all that stuff in, that really kind of pared it to the bone. And I really started working on it. Well, then the pandemic hit and I wasn't able to go to Duke, for example, to the library and look up some more of the things that I was going to look at. But when I looked around my house and saw all the stuff I had, I thought, you know what, you can write the book without that. I think you got enough here to do that. So that's kind of the story of how it all evolved.
Great, wonderful. So I want to get into some of these Methodist women that you highlight in this book. But first want to say, were there, as you did your research, were there any surprises? Was there anything that, you thought was something different than what it turned out to be? What stuck out at you?
I suppose there were some surprises. I didn't realize until I really got into it how much of a network there was of these women and how many of them lived in community and really truly became each other's family. And to the point at which there were women who had very little to do with their family of origin, who had in many cases just cast them out because they become Methodist and really considered these other women to be their true, mother or sister or whatever. And I don't know that this was a surprise, but it was kind of heartwarming, if you will, to see just how much Wesley supported them, in spite of the fact that he was very much a man of his time. He was very patriarchal. He did have those certain ideas, but he gave space for these women's voices to be heard. And I think it just reaffirmed to me how happy I am to be United Methodist and stand in that tradition, because as a Baptist woman, you didn't necessarily get that same sort of sense of support and whatever, even though there were women who were very instrumental in Baptist history early on. But the way that women were in this, just literally from the beginning, and the huge impact that Suzanna Wesley had on her sons in ways that other people maybe have unpacked, but I just didn't fully appreciate until I looked at it. So it was really just amazing to me to see that the story of Methodism truly can't be told without telling the stories of these women.
Yeah.
And yet that is how it's been told. Because when I was at Duke, which was, by the way, fantastic education, we didn't talk a lot about these women. I mean, you got a little mention of Susanna, you got a little mention maybe of Sarah Crosby and Mary Bosanquet, but that was kind of it. And to really dig in and read their stories, and most importantly, to read their own words, was really powerful to me, because it was very obvious that these were women who did these unconventional things because they felt the Spirit was leading them. They didn't wake up one morning and say, oh, I'm going to turn society on its head. I'm going to freak out people in the church. I'm going to be, perceived as unfeminine. They literally just felt that it was God at work within them. And that gave them a sense of boldness to do these things for which they were criticized and, ostracized, and yet to do it with great joy. So that was perhaps a surprise to me, to see just how deeply they felt led by the Spirit.
And that's one of the things, because one of the things I thought about as I read your book at several points was really that kind of movement from the motivation they had, because they felt like they were being led by the Spirit. I mean, in spite of even though they had certain challenges in that time, it really worked well for them to be Methodist, because Wesley's in that vein. In fact, this is why Wesley's allowing these women to have a voice, even though, as you say, he's in the midst of a patriarchal culture. He embraces a lot of that in his time. And yet, I sort of chuckled a little bit on a couple of occasions as I was reading, because, 21st century, but just how Wesley's trying so hard to let these women have their ministries and let them have their voices, because he sees what's happening, but he just needs to make sure it doesn't fall under preaching. So he's sort of trying to split hairs as to, as long as you don't do this and this and that or the other, but yet he really is because of his sensitivity to the Spirit. I mean, maybe that's just one thing that he and these women had in common. They had this sense of the Spirit leading them, and Wesley didn't want to shut that down.
Absolutely not. And I think it's quite funny, as you say, he was splitting hairs about, you're exhorting, if you do this, because he didn't want it to be seen as women preaching, because he didn't want it to be seen as some kind of separation from the Church of England. And that was typical of Wesley all along. He would do things all the time, and it would be like, oh, you're leaving the Anglican Church. And he'd be like, no, I'm really not. So it definitely fell into that vein. It's quite interesting to me that, because he would say, for example, he was so reluctant himself to start field preaching, and talked about submitting to be more vile. And then later on, Mary Bosanquet said, I'd just as soon not be doing this, because I don't necessarily want to be seen as an impudent woman. And then she says, but if my Lord requires me to be still more vile, I will be.
Yeah.
And so I think it's very much that same sense of, I really don't want to be doing this weird thing, but I think God's calling me to do it, so I'm going to do it. And so, they went on from there, without knowing what a massive impact it was going to have, I think. But because they trusted that God was guiding it, I think they didn't worry too much about that.
Yeah. I've thought at times that maybe we United Methodists should change our motto from open hearts, open minds, open doors, which is good, to we desire to be more vile. That actually that might get some attention, if we post it on our church buildings. So the title, Mothers in Israel, explain that, would you?
Yeah, that was, it's always the thing. What are you going to title the sermon? What are you going to entitle anything that you write? And as I was doing the research, I discovered that it was very common for Wesley and some of these early Methodists to refer to some of these women as mothers in Israel, which was taken from the book of Judges in a way that the judge Deborah was described. And Methodism saw itself as a family, and John very much was kind of the father of the family, and it was sister so-and-so and brother so-and-so. But these particular women were called mothers in Israel because they, like Deborah, were very bold. They listened for what God was saying, and they did it. And they were pious. They were kind of the real deal. They just had it all sort of together. So it was a very special thing for a woman to be called a mother in Israel. It wasn't just something that was said of every woman. And since those tended to be the women in these leadership and preaching kind of roles, it just seemed like the perfect title for it. And it was quite funny because, of course, it's a quote, Mothers in Israel. So I originally had it in quotes, but it was going to be weird having it in quotes and having it as the title of the book. So we had to just sort of leave it, as it is. But it's certainly not original with me. And it was something that even in early Methodism in America, there were women who were called mothers in Israel for the same reason. So it's got a long history within our history, but most of us don't know that.
Yeah.
It just hasn't been something that's been told. So yeah, I did want very much, I wanted the subtitle to be something like Impudent Methodist Women, but I think there was another book that already had impudent in it. And so they decided Methodist Beginnings Through the Eyes of Women might be better. So I was disappointed, but okay.
Yeah. Publishers and editors sometimes, yeah. I've always said I want to write a book. I want to write a book and put some interesting words in the index, the subject index, but I never get what I want. Anyway, so let's talk about the first mother in Israel and Methodism, Suzanna Wesley. I mean, I think if there's anything people know about women in Methodism, it's about Susanna. She really, she had, talk a little bit about the incredible impact she had on her sons, and particularly in this instance, we're talking about John, that really helped provide for them the attitude that allowed women to have, for the day, a significant place in the ministries of the church or the movement. Can you talk a little about that?
Yeah, Susanna she would have been a remarkable woman in any age. I mean, if things had been different, she would have probably been the one who started the Methodist movement or moved it along, because she was incredibly intelligent. She was intellectual. She had this immense freedom of conscience that led her to stand up for what she believed against her husband, which led to all sorts of interesting situations. Against, well, pretty much anybody. And it was funny too to me that she would argue theology with her sons who were at Oxford. And she would be like, no, I think you've fallen into a strange way of thinking. And she would tell them this is what she thought. And the fact that they listened to her and paid attention to what she said speaks volumes about the regard they held her in, because they knew that she was, deeply immersed in reading theology, and at the same time deeply immersed in a spiritual life that included journal keeping and constant set aside times for prayer. So in some ways they couldn't have escaped. So what somebody said, no son of Susanna could have ever thought that women could not have their own freedom of conscience. No son of Susanna would have ever thought, oh, a woman can't be in leadership somehow in a spiritual way. And I think that's absolutely true. Because most people know the story about her and the argument that she and Samuel had over who the rightful king was, and she supported one and he supported the other. And Samuel, I tried really hard to be objective in writing about Samuel, but I'm afraid that my feelings towards him really kind of crept out. He would fly off the handle and just get really angry and then just impulsively, do something. So in this particular case, he said very dramatically to her, well, if we don't have one king, we cannot have one bed. I'm separating myself from you. And he left her with, 6 small children at home. I mean, who does that, especially in a time when, how is she supposed to support herself and the children? I mean, it's just appalling to imagine what that was like. And so he kept sort of demanding that she apologize for having this difference of opinion. And she wrote letters to the bishop and to, some other significant people, trying to get them to intervene with Samuel. And she said, I cannot confess a sin, something I don't feel to be a sin. If he's allowed to have his liberty of conscience, why can't he allow my little liberty of conscience? So they grew up with a mother who was practically destitute because of this thing her husband did, and yet she didn't back down, because she said in that same letter, God's going to somehow provide for us. I do believe that. And I'm thinking, wow, I mean, it's just mind-boggling. So that there's that aspect, I think, of it. And then them seeing also that she had this ability to lead the prayer meetings in the rectory when Samuel was away, despite the fact that there was a lot of mumbling from Mr. Inman, the curate, about that. And he wrote to Samuel and said, oh, you need to tell her to stop this. And Samuel was like, oh, you need to stop. And then she said, but this is what I'm doing. And he was like, oh, okay. And then Inman wrote him again, and he got riled up again and said, no, you really do need to stop. And she just kind of put the brakes on it. And she said, if you command me to stop, then I will. but I've told you all the good that this is doing. And I'm not going to stop having these meetings. I'm not going to stop sharing the word of God with the community unless you command it. And you just need to know that you're going to be responsible at the judgment seat for making me lose this opportunity to do good to people's souls. And so he backed down.
Yeah.
That's pretty remarkable. So they grew up with, with all that, with the fact that she would write them, all of her children, she would write them letters in which she told them the most important thing that she had to do on earth was the care of their souls. And so she was encouraging them to study the creed, for example. So she wrote kind of a lesson plan out of the Apostles' Creed for her kids. And, she wrote a lesson plan on the 10 Commandments for her kids. She was just so absolutely dedicated to educating them in the things of God that even if it looked in the way they would have said particular, we'd say peculiar, even if it looked particular, she was going to do these things.
Yeah.
And I love about her that she was so supportive of her sons, because of course people were looking at them and going, what is with these Wesley boys? They're doing these very strange things. And she said, I do indeed rejoice in my sons. And I couldn't be happier if one were the Archbishop of Canterbury and one the Archbishop of York, which is, pretty high praise. And she also wrote an anonymous defense of their theology just a few months before her death, when they were kind of in a Calvinist Arminian argument with George Whitefield. And it was suspected that she was the person who had written this, but it wasn't until the 1960s that Frank Baker, kind of beyond a shadow of a doubt, proved that it was her because of a notation of that he found in a ledger somewhere. And I just think that's incredible that, she picked up a pen and just did that. She didn't think, oh, I'm just a woman, and I need to let people who actually know, I need to let the men who actually know this stuff say stuff about it. No, she took pen in hand and she wrote this kind of astute defense of their theology. And so she just sort of encapsulated the way that a woman could live within the conventions of her time, because she was bound to. There were things that she couldn't do because she wasn't allowed to. And yet she was able to step beyond that, again, because she felt that it was the Spirit pushing her to do it, that it was God calling her to do certain things. And that is one of the things I tried to bring out in the book, is that was the thing that you found in all these women's stories, that none of them were particularly, nobody would have looked at them and said they were firebrands. I mean, they weren't stirring things up just for the heck of it. But that they all indeed found that even within that sphere that was supposed to be the woman's sphere, that the Spirit was giving them the tools and the energy and the fire within to do these other things. And so, yeah, the boys saw this in their mother, and I mean, they would have known from the beginning that women can do things that don't necessarily fall within the categories that we've placed them in. And their sisters, it's really sad to read about their sisters. They all had such really miserable lives, in some ways, because Susanna had educated them at home just as she had the boys before the boys went off to school. But there really weren't men around who were kind of on their same level to marry. And so it led to all sorts of very unhappy marriages. Several of Susanna's children died young. I mean, I can't imagine. She had 19 children in all, and several of them died, some of them as infants and some of them as adults. So she had a lot of sorrow in her life, and yet she just had this deep faith that kept her going. And her sons were going to have a lot of adversity in their lives, and that kept them going, that sense of faith and that bedrock sense of being able to trust God. So yeah, I don't think you can overestimate the influence that she had on him, on John and Charles.
Yeah. You mentioned about the her daughters, Susanna's daughters, John and Charles' sisters, who it feels to me that she raised the daughters and educated the daughters for a time that not yet existed in some sense.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
And so that's unfortunate. Speaking of women fitting in with the conventions, but still being able to be in ministry and do their works, one of the things that did strike me was the issue of celibacy. That there were a couple of the women you talked about who were celibate, which probably in a time was not the preferred status for women, right? I mean, you get married, and you fulfill, all of the roles as a wife and mother in that day, and yet here you have some of these mothers in Israel who are in these communities, taking care of these communities, and really thinking about something I think we've lost that I wish we would recover, and that is the whole notion of celibacy being a calling, or marriage being a calling. That it's not something you automatically do one way or another. I mean, this was a real issue to them, and they were, they're saying, I don't think marriage works because I can't fulfill my call. Talk a little bit about that.
That is a really, really interesting aspect of all this, because many of the women were widowed and had no plans on being married again. Or in the case of Mary Bosanquet, she was single and was exercising her ministry for a long time. She wrote a tract about singleness for women, which is quite interesting, because she's arguing that this is a calling for women to be single and to pursue their ministry. And she only married John Fletcher after many years of they knew each other and weren't in contact. And then he contacted her thinking that he was probably going to die soon. And they did marry, but unfortunately he died 4 years later. And then she spent numerous years, as a widow. So the bulk of her time in ministry was indeed as a single woman. And she had other single women, some of them around her own age, that were living with her in community, but also younger women that she was mentoring and that she was a mother to. So it's interesting that it does go against that whole idea of that women were supposed to be married, they were supposed to have children. It goes against that whole idea that the biological family is the thing, because these were families of affinity and of shared ministry and shared passion and devotion for God, rather than families of blood or any kind of legal ties even. And that really strikes me as part of that whole boldness that these women had in saying, well, this is the way that we feel it's best for us to live, because this is what we can do together. And so they encouraged each other in their preaching ministries. They encouraged each other in educating, the orphans that they took in and trained. They just had a very tight network. And in a way, it's not that they had the same kind of rule of life that nuns would, but in a way, it's sort of female community that overrode the ties of family. So yeah, I think we've lost a sense in Protestantism as a whole, for this sense that being single is a calling for some people, and that's not a defect. And I know I hear a lot of my colleagues who are pastors, who, if they're single, they're constantly bombarded with, oh, let me introduce you to my grandson or whatever, like you have to be married in order to be complete or whatever. And these women didn't feel that. They didn't feel that at all. And they had such a sense of God's love, kind of directly, but also as mediated through each other and the larger Methodist movement, that I don't think they felt any lack of love in that sense. So yeah, it's quite fascinating. Somebody really ought to kind of delve into that part a bit more.
Yeah, one of the things you also said when you talked about your education at Duke, which is something we have in common, and that is that you didn't hear a lot about the women. You heard some, but you even talk about how some Methodist men, leaders, in the publication of these women's works, edited them and essentially cut their voices out for certain reasons, on certain things that they wrote. So what is going on there?
Yeah, that's the thing, that there were various things along as I did research that made me angry, and that I think is the thing that made me the angriest. Because it wasn't that things accidentally happened for these stories to be lost. It was that very deliberate steps were taken to cut out these women's legacy, to kind of paper over what they had done, and to pretend that, that they hadn't done it. And so as long as Wesley was alive, they had a real advocate, because Wesley, bless him, he was bossy. He was large and in charge, and that was the way things were going to be. And if he was in support of these women, then as long as he was alive, they knew that they had his backing, and there really wasn't anything that people who might be mumbling on the edges were going to be able to do. After his death, and especially as Methodism broke away from the Church of England and started becoming its own institution, it started losing a lot of those sort of unconventional things, like having the women preaching. And so it became official basically at, I think in 1805, that if there weren't men available for preaching, well, then the women could, but really they probably shouldn't do it. Although the record clearly shows there were women who were continuing to do it, some of them with some pretty strong support, Mary Bosanquet-Fletcher being one of those. But it was really distressing to me, and did make me really angry to read that, for example, in her writings, I would say that she would qualify as a mystic. She had dreams, and she had very kind of direct experiences of God that perhaps sound very strange to us who live in the 21st century, and we think everything's got to be very rational. And she had written about a dream or a vision that she had in which God was telling her, or Jesus was telling her, to feed the children. And in this dream, she was breastfeeding. And that is an intensely feminine image. And this just got completely cut out when her journal was published. And I'm thinking, really? That sort of thing was just unbelievable to me. And when the Armenian magazine would come out, and it would have obituaries of some of these mothers in Israel, it might mention their work with the poor, and they're educating people and whatever, these sorts of things, the way they assisted the itinerant male preachers. But it would totally leave out the fact that they were preachers, even when that had been the bulk of what their ministry had been, was preaching. Very deliberate attempt to make Methodism look more respectable, because of course it was weird. Quakers and Baptists might have women preachers, but the Church of England didn't do that. And so as Methodists became more of a sort of solidified as an institution, you start getting that sort of pushback. And I don't know exactly what happened on this side of the Atlantic, because that's not what I did my research on, but it would be interesting to see at what point that sort of kicked in over here as well. Because the writings of people like Hester Ann Rogers and Mary Bosanquet-Fletcher were, men and women were reading their journals well into the next century. But then you don't hear about it after that. So it's really interesting that influence was really kind of curtailed at some point. So yeah, that was infuriating to me, to see that it wasn't just that, things happened. It was things deliberately happened to make their voices less heard.
Well, thank God we've got you and others who are telling the stories the way they are intended to be told. So that's good news. That's good news for us. Anyway, let's talk a little bit about some of these other women you highlight, because I don't want to end without doing a little bit of that. And I'm just going to mention the names, and you can just tell me whatever you think about them that's significant. So let's talk about Mary Bosanquet-Fletcher. Did I get that right?
Yeah.
So tell me.
She was amazing. She was wow. There's so much that could be said about her. She was raised in a fairly well-to-do kind of merchant's family, so she wasn't aristocracy, but she was very solidly comfortable, if not luxurious. And she, from the time that she was a young child, had this very sort of mystical experience of God. And she talks very movingly about receiving communion and what that meant to her when she was, I think, 16. And she began to know some of these Methodists and to be influenced by them. And her family was very distressed by this, because they saw them as enthusiasts. They were wild, kind of fanatical people. And what were they doing to influence their daughter? And so they tried to make her promise to stay away from them, and she tried to. And then she finally said to them, I can't. These are the people of God. I need to be part of them. And so her father said, well, you're going to have to leave the house, because you haven't promised that you will stop speaking about them to your brothers, because her brothers were younger. And she said, no, I won't promise to stop speaking about them, so I will leave. So they said that, and then a couple of weeks went by and nothing happened. And she thought, well, is it going to happen or not? And finally they did say, yeah, you need to leave. So she moved out with her maid into circumstances that would not be comfortable to her. She was cold. She was having to worry about how she was going to be fed. I mean, all this sort of thing. And then her family would send her things. It was weird. They didn't cut her off altogether, but they didn't want to hear about this Methodist stuff. But they would send her food, or they'd send her some wine or whatever. And she did have money and some things that she had inherited from a godmother. So she had eventually a place to live that she turned into a school and an orphanage. But she didn't take that as, oh golly, she worried about the fact that she thought she was dishonoring her parents, because she took that commandment very seriously. But she tried to balance that out with, well, but God is calling me in this direction. And so again, it was that freedom of conscience, that overriding sense of the Spirit leading her to do something else. And so she and Sarah Crosby and Sarah Ryan in particular, set up a place together where they lived and took care of each other. And Sarah Ryan was from a completely different social class. She was not wealthy. She was not well educated. She had a bit of a reputation because she had been married to 3 different men, and they had abandoned her at various stages, and perhaps without legally divorcing her. That wasn't clear. And of course, this was hugely scandalous in the 18th century. And yet Mary saw her as her mother. She regarded Sarah Ryan as her mother. And so she was perfectly content for them to live together and her to take care of providing the money and that kind of financial support, because Sarah, being a woman of the world who knew what was up, was very good at learning how to budget and, kind of make things run on a practical level. So it's funny how these women found each other, and their gifts sort of complemented each other. And Mary was so close to Sarah that she called her the friend of my soul. And that was a big thing in early Methodism, was having friends, spiritual friends with whom you could be accountable for spiritual things. And she said she never found anyone else until she married John Fletcher who filled that same kind of position in her life. There were other women that she deeply cared for, and that they shared the ministry and sense of, confessing to each other and so forth. But nobody was ever quite that close to her as Sarah Ryan. And Mary, I think, was really brilliant at thinking things very logically through, kind of the way Wesley was. Wesley was not going to get into an argument with somebody without being able to very calmly say, this leads to this, leads to this, because he just had that kind of mind, and he was trained in debate. And she was, in her own way, she was the same way, because as she and these other women were exhorting, and in fact had become preachers, but that word wasn't really being spoken, she wrote this long letter to Wesley in which she said, I'm going to set down some of the objections that are being raised about us doing this, and I'm going to show you my responses, and please show me if I've gone wrong in any way. But she worded it in such a way that it was going to be, Mr. Wesley, this falls in line with what you said about other things, so I know you're going to have my back. I mean, it's really quite funny. And so she would raise these objections, and then she would answer them using scripture, appealing to Wesley's own actions and words and so forth. And it was really very convincing. And so Wesley said, I think you've not gone too far. I think you're absolutely right that there is such a thing as an extraordinary call, because that was her big thing. She said, every man is not called to preach, neither is every woman. And yet, sometimes there is this extraordinary call. And so Wesley, of course, found that hugely persuasive. In his response to her, he said, I'm convinced that Methodism itself is an extraordinary dispensation of God's grace. If I didn't believe that, I wouldn't be willing to step over the lines of what's been acceptable for so long. And he talks about the men lay preachers as being a prime example of that, which, by the way, Susanna had been instrumental in, getting him to see that men could be lay people and yet be called to preach. So there again, you're seeing that influence of Susanna kind of coming through with John's response to Mary, because he said, I think you're absolutely right. No, not every woman is going to be called to preach, but some are going to have that extraordinary call. And Mary, what she had said, this, I have to think she said this with a hint of humor, because I found it quite funny. She said, you will say, speaking to people objecting, you will say that perhaps the Spirit will only move a woman once or twice in her lifetime to preach, whereas we say it might be once or twice a day. So I just found that really interesting, that she was kind of saying, yeah, I hear what you're saying, but this is what we're saying, and this is our experience of this. And and Wesley found that compelling, because it fell in completely in line with what he was doing with Methodism as a whole. So there's that whole thing about Mary. Then there's the extraordinary relationship that she had, not just with these other women, but with John Fletcher. The 4 short years they were married, they were a clergy couple in all but name, because they exercised a joint ministry of preaching and of educating children and of spiritual direction. And then after his death, she was allowed to stay in the house that had been his only because he was the vicar there, with the extraordinary power of whoever got called to be the local priest. She would have basically veto power over that. That is unheard of. I mean, that's absolutely unheard of. Not to mention the fact that she actually preached in the church at Madeley. She preached in the parish church. She wouldn't get in the pulpit. She'd do it from the steps, but she preached and, actually led morning or evening prayer. Not to mention the fact that she had her own kind of place of worship where she would preach and teach. And I think it's remarkable that in those archives they have in Manchester, that they have her, what she called her watchwords. And these were basically sermon notes that she had. And she had these beautiful thoughts and meditations on different titles for Jesus that she talked about at great length. And also she had watch notes on different titles for the church. And those I haven't been able to get a hold of and read. I would love to see more about that. Yeah. But her watchwords for different words for Jesus were just beautiful and deeply rooted in scripture. And in some cases, very deeply feminine, which again, you do find in scripture. So she was amazing. She lived until 1815. So she lived through a lot of that early Methodist stuff, including the kind of official pushing down of women's roles. And yet nobody tried to do that to her, because she was such a mother in Israel, if you will. And her influence upon other women and on men, because there were numerous Methodist men who became preachers who said it was through her influence. It was through her spiritual advising of them and of her example. So I think she needs to be much better known, and these things that she said and did need to be much better known, because the impact was clearly there and people were very cognizant of that. Whereas today we maybe know her name or not, and that's about it.
Yeah.
So
she was quite, and I took note in your book when we got to the watchwords, because I thought that was, it was well done what she did, but and even though it's not technically preaching as they were concerned about it, it's what preachers do. It's the kind of stuff they do, right? Yeah. So let's talk about, I think we've got time for one more. Let's talk about Sarah Crosby a little bit.
Yeah, Sarah Crosby was part of this early movement of women leaders, and she's considered by some people to be the first woman preacher of Methodism. That may or may not be true, but the reason that she's often called that is because she sort of fell into it by accident, sort of the way Susanna fell into leading those prayer meetings at the rectory. It was kind of like, okay, the people are here, they need to hear the word of God. There's no one else to do it. I'll do it. So Sarah was supposed to be meeting with a class, she thought, of maybe 20, 25 people. Some 200 people showed up. And she knew full well she couldn't speak one-on-one to each of them. So what to do? And Methodists have been, if nothing else, practical. Mr. Wesley was always very practical. There was a problem, he'd figure out a way to deal with it. Well, Sarah was practical too. She thought, I will just tell them a little bit of what God has done for me. We'll sing a hymn, we'll pray, and then I'll find out if Mr. Wesley's okay with that. So that's what she did. Immediately wrote him a letter, and she said, this is what I did. I couldn't think of anything better to do because I knew I couldn't meet with them individually. And he wrote back to her to affirm what she had done. But the funny thing to me in all of that, before she got his response, she did it again. I mean, that when I looked at the dates of that, and I checked it very carefully to see, she did this again before she got his response affirming what she had done, which said to me, and she said in her journal, but she knew that it was of the Spirit, that it was of God, and that God owned that ministry. And I thought that was absolutely breathtaking. That when she did it the first time, she thought, well, I better get permission, or at least forgiveness, from Mr. Wesley for this. But the opportunity came up a couple of days later, and she went ahead and did it because she felt so moved by the Spirit. And that was just amazing, absolutely amazing. And he did, of course, say, well, yeah, I think I don't think of anything else you could have done. You did the right thing. Still wasn't calling it preaching, but that was kind of that watershed moment, at least as far as we know, of that happening. And she continued her preaching. She was very itinerant. She lived part of the time with Mary. She lived part of the time with some other women up in Yorkshire. And she continued preaching almost up until the moment of her death. And interestingly, several of these women are buried together. Sarah Ryan and Sarah Crosby, and at least one other woman are buried in the same grave, Ann Tripp, which I think is absolutely amazing. They were together in life, and they're together in death. And they were, on their gravestone, which I haven't seen yet, but I hope to while I'm here. It talks about them being mothers in Israel. So, these really were very remarkable women who did what they could because God gave them the grace to do it. And they would sometimes feel very unworthy, and yet they did it anyway. And I think any of us who are ministers feel that, because there are times when we feel like, well, why in the world would God take anything that I could possibly do and do anything with it? And I think they offer a word of encouragement to us to say, it doesn't matter what the constraints are around you. You can still say something for God. And I think that's a powerful word for anyone who's in ministry, no matter male, female, whatever.
Yeah, the call of God. There are moments where it's like, why? God, what were you thinking? Right? But
exactly.
Anyway. Well, I wanted to read just a couple sentences of your conclusion. I really appreciate it. You're summing everything up here. And you talk about these mothers in Israel, the women. You say their obedience to God pushed the boundaries of accepted behavior for women, challenged the expectations of a woman's place in public life, brought the gospel of Jesus Christ to rowdy people in unconventional places, and paved the way for the eventual ordination of their spiritual daughters. To them we owe a debt of gratitude we cannot pay for their holy boldness, their stubborn obedience, their honest self-appraisal, and their wise spiritual counsel to the people called Methodists. They really have left us a wonderful legacy, haven't they?
They really have. They really have.
Yeah, and I think that sentence sums up what you said there. Sums up they just like John Wesley submitted to become more vile. Thank God for that.
Exactly.
Yeah. Well, Donna, I just want to tell you how much I appreciate you taking the time. Any last minute thing you want to sum up before we close this out?
I just want to say how happy I am to have an opportunity to talk about this. And, I'll be happy to speak with people on Zoom if it happens to be in a situation where I could do it in person, whatever. I'll be more than happy to talk about this, because I really do think these women's names ought to be as familiar to us as, any of those early people. I think a lot of times we don't know our history anyway. So it's not just the women who've been forgotten. but particularly because they were so deliberately forgotten by some people, I really would like for their voices to be heard, and their their spiritual thoughts and their spiritual counsel, because a lot of what they said was very practical as well as being very spiritual. And we need that to have a more complete picture of what Methodism and particularly Wesleyan Methodism ought to look like and be like. And in a time of so much fragmentation in the denomination, I think it's great to have voices that were united and that were very communal and very much connected, because that whole idea of connection is so deeply Methodist.
They
and
really,
is
really,
key to
they
who
really
we
found
are.
ways to
So,
work through all the tensions, didn't they?
yeah,
It wasn't easy, but they managed to find a way. And some lessons for us. Well, anyway, thank you very much, friends. This is the book. I urge you to get it and read it. Mothers in Israel. The subtitle is what the author didn't prefer. Methodist Beginnings Through the Eyes of Women. This is a wonderful book, and we hardly scratched the surface of all that's in here. So Reverend Dr. Donna Fowler-Marchant, I got that right, I think.
there you
And
go.
we thank you. And friends, this is Alan Bevere at Faith Seeking Understanding, and the patron saint of Faith Seeking Understanding University is Anselm of Canterbury, who said, "I do not understand in order to believe, but I believe in order to understand." So friends, keep seeking.